Morning, everyone. Here with us at the Wake Up Club breakfast is David Martosko. He is the U.S. political editor for the Daily Mail Online, and it's one of my favorite websites. If you haven't checked it out, I strongly encourage you to do so. Prior to coming to the Daily Mail, he worked as the executive editor at the Daily Caller, another fantastic news website based here in D.C., and prior to that, spent a decade in public affairs. Actually, I had the good fortune of meeting him at CPAC. He probably doesn't remember this. And, we had a quick chat, and I asked him, if he had any tips for up-and-coming journalists, and he told me this was some knowledge passed on from Tucker Carlson, that there's 2 rules of journalism. The first one is pretty simple. 1, always tell the truth. Tell that to Anthony Weiner. Anyways, rule number 2, have as much fun as possible while following the first rule. Hopefully this morning his speech follows those 2 rules as well. I look forward to hearing what he has to say. There's big changes afoot in journalism. The Washington Post was recently bought by a new owner, someone a little more savvy, I think, than the previous family running it. So please welcome me this morning and welcome Mr. David Martosko.
Actually, rule number 2 was get as much free stuff as possible. Wow. But yeah, same idea. I'm a big fan of press junkets, as long as I don't have to write any lies in the newspaper. Well, thank you so much for coming out this early in the morning. Please forgive me if I'm a little slow. It's early for me too, and I have not yet had my breakfast cigar. I should say at the outset, I definitely owe my career in journalism to, in many ways, to Tucker Carlson and his amazing team of incredibly creative malcontents at the Daily Caller. To give you an idea of what that place is like, last year I gave a speech in Colorado where I announced, quite seriously at the time, that we were at the Daily Caller about to inaugurate an LGBT section. Only in that case that stood for liberals, guns, beer, and tobacco. That's. I should also say that now that although I'm U.S. political editor at the Daily Mail in London and its very popular website Mail Online, my remarks today do not necessarily represent the views of my employer. It's just me shooting from the hip, and as soon as I'm done here, I'll be downstairs smoking something Nicaraguan. You're welcome to join me. Those of you who know me know that I absolutely love cigars, fatty food, and caffeine, which means I consider the FDA to be one of the most misguided, idiotic, and nanny state supremacist organizations ever conceived in world history, and I'm not exaggerating. Look, Michael Bloomberg is just a symptom. The FDA is the real deal. And when you combine it with the CDC, there's just an insane opportunity for mischief that usually flies under people's radar. Those of you in the room who, like me, are old enough to hate rap music, anybody here? Okay. You're probably also old enough to recall the FDA's war against saturated fats in the 1980s. Like they promoted trans fats as an alternative to beef tallow and butter, right? Now, of course, saturated fats have a big halo. Trans fats kill children. Everything's flipped around. You've heard the old Mark Twain saying about the weather in New England. If you don't like it, wait 5 minutes and it'll change. The FDA's like that. If you don't like the verdict issued on your favorite food, beverage, or other device, just wait 5 years and it'll completely change. Coffee and red wine have spent alternating years in the FDA's penalty box since, the 1990s. Remember how tuna fish was going to give us all mercury poisoning? Yeah, not so much. But you never hear an apology from the federal government when it gets things consistently wrong. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. It's because the attitude of government, and I think progressives in general, it has one direction. It goes forward. There's no reverse gear. They're only interested in marching forward and what happened last year, even if it caused damage. Like Jenny McCarthy with her anti-vaccine nonsense. I mean, how many thousands of children have died because their parents didn't vaccinate them because she was on Oprah once? Nobody's ever going to apologize for that, and the FDA works that way. And yes, the FDA is regulating cigars too. I have to mention that. They actually want to regulate cigars the way they regulate cigarettes. And they actually have the authority to do this, by the way. If they get their way, nobody will be able to buy a cigar over the internet anymore. You won't be able to walk into a humidor and choose a cigar if that's what you're doing. The taxes will actually double the price of a Macanudo, maybe even more. I have it on good authority, by the way, that the FDA wants to apply the same kind of nanny statism to cigars that they currently have up in the province of Ontario. If you go into a cigar shop up there, you're not allowed to see, touch, or smell a cigar before you buy it. I'm serious. You can't do it. By law, they're literally kept in a back room like pornography. And the shopkeeper can only show you black and white line drawings of the different shapes of the cigars in a binder. That's all they're allowed to do by law. They can't counsel you. This one's medium to full. That one tastes like nutmeg and earth, or whatever the heck they, this one's got a deep fruity nose and a long hairy arm. I mean, they can't talk to you about these things. And if you actually get your hands on a cigar, you have to stare at one of those diseased lungs pictures before you can cut it. All of this, of course, is premised on the idea that grown-ups can't be trusted with a lighted stick of tobacco. I mean, it's ridiculous. My operating theory is a little bit different. We're in the age of Obamacare now, right? And the word of the day is cost savings. We're hearing about death panels, healthcare exchanges, all designed to, at least, if it works, probably won't, but designed at least in theory to reduce some of the costs of healthcare. So I figure that by smoking 5 to 10 cigars a week, eating steak on a regular basis, subsisting on an IV drip of Diet Coke, I'm probably going to kick off 6 months early. I will save the healthcare system millions of dollars. That should make me a national hero, not some kind of pariah. I mean, they should build a statue in my honor in Cleveland, where I come from. That would be great. But let's talk about Obamacare a little bit. I mean, it's the most unpopular thing in Washington since, the Vietnam War, Rahm Emanuel, take your pick. Even the president's own fawning acolytes are starting to see the writing on the wall, I think. On Sunday, just this past Sunday, the group Organizing for Action, which used to be Obama for America, but then changed, they started a month-long August push to advocate for a lot of Obama's policies, starting with Obamacare. And here's how big the uphill climb is for them right now in public opinion. 3 days ago in Centerville, Virginia, just about a half an hour west of here, they held a phone bank event where dozens or maybe hundreds of people were expected to come to this place in Centerville and man a phone bank where they were going to call all these people and say, defend Obamacare, the president's a great guy, tell your friends, your neighbors, your local PTA that it's awesome. Guess how many people attended? One. You know this story. I mean, there's some little old lady who's still driving around in her Buick LeSabre with a Carter Mondale sticker, right? Maybe she got lost on her way to a Unitarian peace rally. I don't know. You all know about the Unitarian Ku Klux Klan? They go around burning question marks on people's lawns. Yeah, that was a low blow. I'm sorry. I just don't know how to talk about what's going on in Washington without cracking jokes. It's not possible. Soberly looking at this stuff, sometimes it's too depressing. You've got all the phony scandals, right? Let's go through the Catechism of phony scandals really quickly. No one knows who altered the Benghazi talking points, but the State Department says it's still investigating. Sort of like OJ wanting parole so he can find the real killers, We apparently, as of yesterday, now have a sealed indictment in the Benghazi terror attack. I don't know if you've heard this, against a guy named Ahmed Abu Khattala. He founded Ansar al-Sharia, which is sort of a native Libyan group that's tied to Al-Qaeda. And it's that group which is suspected of planning and executing the September 11th attack. CNN actually had an interview on the air with him last night. Pretty remarkable, considering that the FBI has never talked to him. According to him, they've never even sought him out. But CNN found him. I mean, it's been 9 months since the attack. He's been walking around Libya, not hiding in any way, just hanging out. We've indicted the guy without even interviewing him. Anybody here think the Justice Department actually tried to find him? Looked him up in the phone book in Libya? Okay, the administration keeps reminding us of those halcyon days 40 years ago, back when the White House had an enemies list. The president's men were spying on reporters. They used the IRS to harass their political enemies. Well, thank God those are days that are over or done with, right? Okay, Eric Holder has promised, Scout's honor, that his DOJ will not snoop on reporters' emails anymore. I feel very comfortable with that, being a journalist. This story, by the way, turned the White House press room into a feeding frenzy of anti-Obama fervor for about a week, which is pretty remarkable considering the mood of the press corps. Not that they got any answers out of Jay Carney, of course. He's best known for saying little of substance. This is a true story. Last week, I was in the press briefing room, and reporters are starting to get the joke. And after Carney left the podium, I swear this is true, I heard a reporter a few rows back joke to the person next to him that the administration thinks "don't ask, don't tell" is such a great policy they've brought it to the West Wing. I thought it was pretty cool. I don't even know who the guy represented. Maybe it was BuzzFeed. I don't know. Okay, the NSA, it turns out, is constitutionally incapable of keeping the lid on its cookie jar. It just can't do it. It's probably reading everything on my laptop right now, except for the Constitution. Somewhere, Edward Snowden is out, fishing, motorcycle riding, and cruising chicks with Vladimir Putin. That's what he does. Okay, Osama bin Laden is dead, and Al Qaeda is on the run. Oh, I'm sorry, that was from last year's speech. Don't you kind of pine nostalgically for the days when the big scandal was when reporters mocked the Bush administration because Dan Quayle couldn't spell potato? I mean, it seems so quaint now. I suppose I should talk a bit about Al Qaeda, because we're all sitting here wondering if we've shuttered too many embassies, not enough embassies, just the right amount. I never lived in Chicago or New York when organized crime was at its peak. But I think that if mob bosses threatened to break your kneecaps if you didn't pay your money to them from the grocery store, and then in retaliation you closed the grocery store, probably wouldn't be a very good strategy. Look, I'm all in favor of taking the battle to the backward Islamists who want to drive Israel into the Mediterranean and enslave our wives and girlfriends. I hate them as much as most Americans do. But if we can't do that, if we really can't take the battle to them consistently and effectively, I personally think, and there's no joke here, the least we can do is send a platoon of Marines to every last Middle Eastern embassy for the week instead of closing it. We've hoisted the white flag, basically, and cleared out a lot of space for the Al Jazeera cameras instead of taking a stand. I think a platoon of Marines would send a better message than closing things, but that's just my opinion. Unfortunately, as Benghazi has taught us, the State Department doesn't exactly have a sterling record of defending its diplomatic posts, even on the anniversary of 9/11. It's funny, and this is not at all serious, but if the Obama administration really wants to topple Al Qaeda on the Arabian Peninsula, it can just rename it the Al Qaeda Tea Party in the Arabian Peninsula. Sick the IRS on them. I mean, the paperwork and the intrusive questions will have Ayman al-Zawahiri spinning his wheels for years. It'll be awesome. Al Qaeda has always struck me as an odd institution, honestly. I've been watching the early James Bond movies recently. The really good ones, Dr. No, Thunderball, From Russia with Love. Any of you who've seen those, you remember the super evil organization Spectre? Always said like Spectre. It's really cool. It had the best acronym in the history of film, the Special Executive for Counterintelligence, Terrorism, Revenge, and Extortion. Such a great name. 007 always got the better of, Ernst Stavro Blofeld. That's why we always watch the movies, right? He was a proxy for the Soviet Union. Nowadays, most of the Bond villains are corporate industrialists, environmental polluters. Have you noticed this? It's true. Tells you a little bit where Hollywood's priorities are. Now, Spectre itself was invariably feckless. They spent trillions of dollars but had no meaningful results to show for it because they always got foiled. They couldn't keep their eyes on the ball long enough to defeat their enemies. They almost never shot straight. And the guy referred to as number two always had a short shelf life. At least he was a consistent butt of jokes if he wasn't expendable. So that either sounds like Al Qaeda right now, remember all the number twos, or maybe the current federal government. I mean, look at our number two right now. He's the butt of jokes constantly. But the problem here is that Al Qaeda always enjoys showing the world it can kind of give us a devastating swirly in the toilet whenever it wants to. And that's problematic because the president doesn't want to let on that he's intimidated. Whether he is or not, he can't let on. So at least publicly right now, he's left talking 100% about jobs, housing, and the economy instead of talking forcefully about, suitcase nukes and drone attacks. I personally think that should be the subject of every single Saturday radio address until Al Qaeda is actually on the run. That would be nice. And Russia, which actually resembles the Soviet Empire more and more every day, if you follow the news, also enjoys showing the world that America's weak and that we lack the guts to intervene in places like Iran and Syria. Got my Middle East confused. That they might be right about that. I mean, Russia, I think, is causing us as much consternation, maybe as much damage, by propping up Assad and the mullahs in Iran as it ever did, you know, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan 30 years ago. Now, back in the Reagan years, you remember one of the responses to the Soviets when they invaded Afghanistan was that we boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics. And I'm hearing some buzz about the possibility that we might do that again next year when Russia hosts the Winter Games in the Black Sea resort town of Sochi. Now, before you dismiss this idea out of hand as silly and a hollow gesture that'll dash the hopes of, you know, skiers and bobsledders everywhere, I want you to think about this critically in a slightly different way. See, I don't think Moscow in 1980 is the correct frame of reference for this question. I think it's Munich in 1972. You know, that's when 11 Israeli athletes were kidnapped and killed by a Palestinian terror group. Most Americans have no concept of the geography of Russia, certainly not of the Caucasus region, you know, on the border of Europe and Asia. And that's where Sochi is. It's in the Caucasus region. It's not up by Moscow or St. Petersburg. Now, here's a sobering thought. The distance from Sochi to the center of Dagestan, where Tamerlan Tsarnaev was taught to build, you know, bombs, is the same as the distance from Washington, D.C. to Atlanta. That's how close it is. And the distance from Sochi to Tehran is the same as the distance from D.C. to Miami. That's how close that is. Less than halfway there is Azerbaijan, where 29 people linked with Iran, you know, they have a trial. They're plotting to assassinate the leader there last year, the president. Now, my sources have told me that the explosive devices that the Azerbaijanis prepared for those attacks were the same exact mixture, composition, and pressure cookers that Tsarnaev used in Boston. That's maybe an hour and 10-minute flight from Sochi. Now, was Tsarnaev involved with the Azerbaijani plot? I mean, who knows? It's impossible to tell. But the ultimately foiled attack was scheduled to take place at the same time Tsarnaev was actually in Dagestan. Let's put this another way. If we were holding the Olympics in Washington, D.C., and we had militant groups in Atlanta running around bombing synagogues, do you think anyone would blame the Israelis for not showing up? I don't. So given what we know right now, I'd say the whole region of the Caucasus is a giant pressure cooker. And I really don't think we'd be blamed all that much in the final analysis, especially as more terror attacks occur, or more terror attacks are known, even the ones that are foiled. You know, Russia has Ed Snowden, which means they already have access to our most secret intel gathering techniques and capabilities. Russia partners with Syria and Iran. I mean, Putin could have Snowden in Yemen in less than 4 hours, and I'm not exaggerating. All I'm saying here is that the proximity of Sochi to a lot of bad guys should give everybody pause. I'm not saying we should boycott, we shouldn't, but I mean, forget about the political symbolism of it all. Sochi could literally be a suicide mission for our athletes. And given how bad we are at protecting our people overseas, I think it's worth talking about. Now, we can't exactly start firing drone missiles into an ice rink. It doesn't work that way if we have problems when we're there. You can't just mass army battalions in the Olympic Village, and the Black Sea will probably be swarming with Russian tankers and Russian troop transports and Russian battleships. So would be outnumbered there if something really horrible happened. I don't want to be gearing up to say I told you so. I really don't. But if a little al-Qaeda chatter in Yemen is sufficient for us to close 19 embassies in the Middle East, I'm not inclined to believe that the Olympics, by some contrast, will be a magical place of fairy dust and unicorns where everybody will consider warfare off limits. I don't think it'll happen that way. And 1972 Munich taught us that, or should have taught us that. Meanwhile, if you saw the president on The Tonight Show last night, his big problem with Sochi is when we go there, the Russians won't be fair to gays and lesbians. That's his big concern. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm pretty libertarian when it comes to what people do in their private space. I really don't care. But I don't think that's the most pressing issue when we send athletes in, you know, within a stone's throw of where Tamerlan Tsarnaev trained. shift gears a bit. I know that's very sad to talk about. I think actually the Olympics provides an interesting case study in journalism, since I'm here to talk primarily about journalism. You all know that Amazon.com's founder bought the Washington Post, right? Which makes perfect sense because the Post is really good at delivering the news in 3 to 5 days. I heard somebody quip yesterday that if you buy Washington Post Prime now, you can get the news without the Ziggy cartoons. I don't know if that's true or not. Let's just imagine for a moment that our athletes are in Sochi and there's a genuine terror threat articulated on the radio from a group in Dagestan aimed at our hockey team. Okay, that's the premise here. The Post, of course, would predict that the president will get on Air Force One and charm the terrorists into submission. That would be their line. The New York Times would run a deeply analytical story about the terrorist group in question. It would ramble on for 2,000 words, and at the end they would claim it's all Bush's fault. The Associated Press would rush to the White House press room to get Jay Carney's comment. You can't run a story in this town without Jay Carney's, I'm sorry, did I say comment? I meant no comment, I'm sorry. Politico would go around Capitol Hill asking people whether or not this hurts Hillary's chances in 2016. NBC News would do an hour-long special with Chris Hayes and Rachel Maddow about how if Mitt Romney had been elected president, the whole hockey team would have been dead years ago. BuzzFeed, God love him, would run a slideshow of animated GIFs showing Dagestani women wearing bikinis under their hijabs. But seriously, I actually believe the British media, where I work right now, whether it's the Daily Mail or the Guardian or somebody else, would probably be the first ones to name the suspects, get photographs of them online, get a list of their demands in the terrorist's own handwriting. I mean, that's what we're good at. Filling in the details, chasing the stories in the way that it's a big deal when CNN goes to the Middle East and talks to a terrorist guy. I mean, the British media do this all the time. They don't have a stake in America's success or failure or anything. They're just there to report the news in America. And that's what I'm really proud to be a part of now. Plus, the Daily Mail is fearless. I think they work harder than anybody else in the business. Last month alone, we had 134 million unique visitors. That's insane. I mean, it puts us in a whole different category of every other newspaper online, ever. And yes, the online paradigm is where all news is right now. I mean, I say this knowing full well that the Daily Mail actually prints 1.9 million newspapers a day in a country that's roughly the size of Michigan. So print is still very popular in London and all over England, but not here so much. The Sun, Daily Sun in London, which is Rupert Murdoch's paper, actually prints slightly more newspapers than the Daily Mail, but that's only because they run topless pictures on page 3 every day, and I'm not making that up. That might have something to do with the circulation numbers. My wife is probably watching this, so I'll have to say I've heard about that, honey. I haven't seen it. On this side of the pond, however, things are different. I teach an online journalism class here twice a year, by the way. It's a lot of fun, and if you are interested in that, I encourage you to come. And I always ask my students to come up with the name of one, and just one, website that killed newspapers. Can anyone tell me what one website killed newspapers by itself? Not the Drudge Report. Craigslist. Give that man a cigar. Craigslist killed newspapers, and here's why. Classified ads used to cost money. And in some newspapers, recently as 10 years ago, classified ads made up more than 1/3 of all revenues. It was a big business. Obituaries, sell your car, help wanted, yard sale. People spent good money for that stuff, and now they don't. Between 2000 and 2009, nationally, classified ad sales dropped by 70% in the United States. Craigslist killed newspapers. That's why you have page sizes shrinking. The New Orleans Times-Picayune has gone to 3 days a week. The Cleveland Plain Dealer is probably going to fold. The Seattle Times doesn't print anymore. That's where it's going. We've got fire sales of the Washington Post. I mean, help wanted ads as a category are down by 90% in the same 10 years in print. Obviously, Monster.com had a lot to do with that. And nationally, all print advertising in the media, including display ads, was down 58% in the decade that just ended last December. So that's how much money print is losing. Newspaper circulation, to be fair, was actually up 5% last year. But I don't think that's an indication that people are reading more newspapers. Here's why. Ad sales were also down 6% during the same year. So the increase in the number of newspapers that were printed is probably a sign that newspapers are doing everything they can to pump up their circulation numbers so they can justify selling the ads for higher dollar amounts. When you sell an ad to somebody, a full-page ad, what you can get for it, what the market will bear, has a lot to do with how many people see it. So if you print more newspapers, you could say this is our circulation, it's 100,000 or it's 500,000. I think the Washington Post is 477,000 now. That you can sell the ad for more than if you only circulated 420,000. And once you print 420,000 newspapers, the next 50,000 cost almost nothing. You're just paying for paper, ink, and press time. You don't have to pay all the setup charges, the composition fees for the talent. You don't have to pay that over and over again. So there comes a point at which it's cost effective to practically give the subscriptions away. And if you've been into a Costco lately and you see the Washington Post saying you can subscribe for 90 cents a week or whatever, heck, I think that's what's going on. So your ad rates will climb at a faster rate than your costs. Now, with that in mind, let's think for a minute about Amazon.com's founder buying the Post. The purchase price was $250 million. Okay? It may sound like a lot, but consider that Facebook recently spent $1 billion, 4 times as much, just for Instagram. And that organization was, what, 2 years old? You know, the Post was 135 years old, so it's taken forever to build up a quarter of the value. Mark Stein, whom I love very much, noted on Sunday that in 1999, the Worcester Telegram and Gazette, which is in central Massachusetts, okay, the Worcester Telegram and Gazette, not exactly the paper of record, sold for $295 million, more than the Post just sold for. Now, a little bit east in Boston, John Henry, the principal owner of the Red Sox, just bought the Boston Globe for just $70 million. Less than a quarter of what this podunk paper in Worcester sold for 14 years ago. Now, when the New York Times bought the Globe in 1993, it paid $1.1 billion. Now it's worth $70 million. If you adjust for inflation, that $1.1 billion would be worth like 1.78 something billion right now. That's what the New York Times said the Globe is worth, and they just bought it for $70 million bucks. That's 4% of what it used to be worth. So that's how bad off newspapers are. Oh, and by the way, when he bought the Boston Globe, that Worcester paper, the $295 million paper, they threw that in as a pot sweetener. I'm not kidding. That's now part of the deal. One analyst wrote on Saturday that if you look at the Boston Globe deal, the buyer basically paid the same amount he would have. This is the Boston Globe being bought by the owner of the Red Sox. Mr. Henry paid basically the same amount of money he would have if he was just seeking to buy the real estate. So he bought a bunch of buildings and they threw in the newspaper for free. So you see how screwed newspapers are, right? So it's all going online. I think it's safe to say that we have more domestic readers than the New York Times, certainly than the Boston Globe, and definitely more than the Washington Post has readers. I mean, my daughters are 9 and 5 years old, and I haven't a clue how they'll be getting their news in 10 years. I just don't know. Google glasses, neural implants, you know, silicon-coated contact lenses that get radio waves from metro rails. I don't have a clue. I also have no idea what domestic politics will look like in a decade, and anybody who says they have a crystal ball is lying. Anybody who says they know whether Chris Christie will run for president is lying. I think odds are, and I can't confirm this, that Mrs. Christie has set a weight limit for him. If you hit this, you can run. If you don't, you can't. I mean, could you have predicted Jimmy Carter in 1966? Really? You know, Ronald Reagan in 1970? Jimmy Carter? Barack Obama? Could you have predicted him in 1998? Not a chance. So all I can do is report what I see and hopefully do it while having a lot more fun than the other guys. I genuinely want to thank the Leadership Institute for having me here today and for your kind attention. You've been a really great crowd to talk to. I was asked to take a few questions, and so I will try to not channel Jay Carney and actually give you some answers. So with that, I invite your questions, and thank you for having me. Can I answer any questions, or are you going to make me look like a fool? It wouldn't be the first time, but anybody about a news? Yes, sir, in the back.
Wait for the microphone.
There we go.
If newspapers are worth, let's say, 5% of what they were 10 years ago. What do you think broadcast news is worth, television specifically, today compared to 10 years ago?
Well, here's the thing. Unlike newspapers, the broadcast news networks, and frankly the cable news networks too, are part of larger conglomerate companies. CBS and Viacom, Fox News and News Corp. NBC is part of NBC Universal, which includes other companies and so forth. CNN, part of, at least used to be part of a larger conglomerate, now part of Turner. So the big companies can afford, ABC, when I worked for them in radio, used to be owned by Disney. So the news organizations on broadcast side can afford to lose money and have it be absorbed by other parts of the enterprise. And in some cases, they're losing a lot of money. Certainly the Washington Post is losing money, but I also would suspect that MSNBC is losing its shirt. As a division of NBC Universal, the ratings are horrible. You can buy an ad for peanuts. So how could they possibly be making a profit given what they're paying Rachel Maddow and Joe Scarborough? It's not possible. So I think in cases like that, they're definitely losing money. They're going to keep losing money. But it's a point of prestige for the corporation to keep it going. So they will keep them going, but they will lose lots of money in the process because the rest of the corporation can afford to absorb the losses. In fairness, I should mention that the Daily Mail is owned by the Daily Mail General Trust, which dates back to 1896. Our patron is, I think his name is the fourth Lord of Rothermere. So we're one of the British press barons. I've never met the guy. Sounds like a real nice chap. Daily Mail General Trust is a big conglomerate. If we ever fell in hard times, the rest of our enterprise could absorb the losses. That's how smart news is done. I think the fault of the Washington Post is that they didn't diversify into mining and coal and, oh God, they wouldn't do that, would they? They didn't diversify in order to couch the losses when they started bleeding. So any other questions? Yes, sir, right here. Yes, you. Oh, okay, we got the microphone.
Thank you. There's a newspaper, I think maybe it's Orange County Times, which is
Orange County Register?
Yes,
Yeah.
it has went in the reverse direction where they hired more staff. Basically, they're bringing premium content, and their idea is to charge $1 a day. Everything's behind a paywall, so it's pretty much the opposite direction. You have any insight on that, where they think that'll be successful, or?
I'm generally of the opinion that paywalls are a fool's errand because you're limiting your opportunity to grow in reach and prestige. I think it's interesting what Orange County has done because they've demonstrated that there is a certain segment of the audience that will pay for content. I don't want to generalize and say liberals won't pay for content and conservatives will, but the Orange County paper is somewhat right of center, sort of like the Santa Barbara News Press or the Washington Times. And it may very well be true that people who are right of center politically will be willing to pay for a news outlet that they see as a needed alternative to the mainstream press. It may be that that's how it's being driven, whereas liberals, won't pay for paywall cost in the Washington Post because they can always go to 10 other papers that are saying the same thing. So I think it's possibly true that the more unique your news perspective is, the more willing you can corner a very specific niche marketplace that's willing to pay for it. But I think the jury's still out. We'll have to see. Yes, sir, in the blue.
Being that a lot of us are candidates prospective candidates, where would you see our dollars best be spent as far as advertising if press is not?
I don't know enough about state-specific media markets to recommend anything to you in terms of TV or radio, or you really need a good professional analyst for that. But I will tell you that it's my personal opinion that the best deal online right now is Facebook. Facebook, unlike most ads, if you buy an ad on not BuzzFeed, they don't take ads. If you run an ad on the Washington Post or the Daily Mail, oh, by the way, BuzzFeed does take ads. It's just called sponsored content, but they don't run banner ads. But if you buy an ad from somebody, usually you pay per impression. You can buy from the Daily Mail or from the New York Times, and you pay on a rate that's called CPM. It's the cost per 1,000 impressions. So we flash that ad on 1,000 page views, and whether anybody ever clicks on it or not, you owe us a certain amount of money. Facebook, however, their primary model is cost per click. So you can actually expose your stuff to 1 million people while only paying for like 1,000 impressions. It's a very good deal in my money. I used to be in PR, and we bought Facebook campaigns all the time. Facebook has one other thing going for it, which is the ability to target really intensely. You can actually buy an ad on Facebook. You can buy an ad in the New York Times and say, I only want it to be shown to people in Georgia. They'll geo-target it for you. But Facebook will interest target it for you. You could say, I want this ad to run, freaking, I don't know, until 1,000 people click on it, but I only want people who say their likes include schnauzers, bananas, and Rachel Maddow. I mean, you can literally do that. You want to corner that schnauzer, banana, Maddow market, you can have that, and they'll do it for you. It's just flipping a switch. It's just software. So they can do that for you, which I think makes it very efficient. You could literally say, I only want to target Virginians from the following, geographical area who like any of the 10 following things, and you could include the RNC, Ted Nugent, the NRA, Rush Limbaugh, whatever, and you would just reach your target audience, which would be very helpful in a primary. And then if you win the primary, you could switch your targeting and say, I just want to blanket these 5 counties, whatever it is. So it's very helpful, and I'm a big fan of Facebook advertising. I think it's helpful, especially if you're smart about what you run. If you want to get the most bang for your buck, don't be very specific with your ad. Don't try to fit your message into a postage stamp. Just put your brand on it. You don't want people to click on it because then you pay money. You just want to get your brand and drive name awareness. And then in some week where you're making some announcement trying to make news about your position on gun control or assisted suicide, then put that message in there. That would be my advice. Yes, ma'am, in the back. Morton will tell me when it's time to wrap up questions, I assume. I'm not paying attention to the time at all. I'm enjoying this too much. Yes?
We really appreciate your presentation. I'm curious to know, since you are in the media, what are you and your colleagues thinking about what's currently happening in Mexico, where technically there's no freedom of the press because of the threat of the cartels? Like the newspapers can no longer report on what's going on.
Yeah.
And because of that, the Jane and Joe citizen in Mexico tried to take up that load by going to blogging, and then they started being killed off. So the most number of reporters in the world are actually being assassinated and killed off in Mexico. How is that being discussed within your arena?
Mexico is perceived by most people in developed countries as a third world nation, even though it really isn't. It's seen as sort of a bastard stepchild of the free world, mostly because of the drug cartel, partially because of poverty, and then in the United States because of the immigrant flow. I think that opinion bleeds over into journalism, whether we like to admit it or not. And most of the talk I've heard about that from advocates of freedom of the press, the National Press Club has a wonderful section on freedom of the press I'm a big fan of. Most of the talk I've heard has kind of thrown up its hands and says, well, it's unfortunate the Mexican nationals won't be able to carry the weight, but at least we have Univision and Telemundo who are telling those stories in a way that anybody in Mexico can read. I think that's a little bit more complacent than I'd like to hear, but I also can't fault the big media organizations from refusing to send people into harm's way. If we had a situation where, say, some half-cocked sheriff in the middle of Arkansas was walking around shooting conservative journalists, I don't think anybody would blame Fox News for closing its bureau in Little Rock. You have to look at it practically speaking. And I think in a country like Mexico, unlike other places, you are consciously and knowingly taking your life into your own hands if you're an anti-drug cartel blogger anywhere in the country. I think, not to minimize the deaths, but I think you go in with your eyes open knowing exactly what's likely to happen to you and your family. To that extent, I think it's a diagnosis of insanity to do it, especially when a dozen people get killed. You're definitely insane by trying to do the same thing again and hoping for a different result. So as much as I'd be in favor of a free press in Mexico as everywhere else, including Egypt, Syria, Iran, the underlying problem is the drug trade. And whether your solution is to hit them with drones or to legalize it everywhere, until the drug trade problem is fixed, the press problem won't be fixed. How about you, sir, in the middle? Oh, okay.
Somewhat off the wall question.
Oh, my favorite kind.
Do you think Stephen Pearlstein is just a good reader of the future, or what? Having switched from the Post to GMU.
I honestly don't know. I'm not familiar enough with Pearlstein's stuff to know. I mean, if you'd ask me about Nate Silver, I might have an opinion, but I really don't want to wade into that because I don't know. It's much easier than trying to make something up. Yes, sir. Yep, you in the front.
Mainstream media has often been accused of having a liberal bias, but as these traditional gatekeepers start to fall and we see, decline in print media and broadcast, How do you see the rise of the internet affecting that? Do you see more views being represented? Do you predict that the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world will make it even more liberal than it has been? Can you comment on that?
I'll say one thing and one thing only, because it's hard to predict what will happen in all of this stuff. If you looked 3 years ago at the media landscape, you would have the so-called mainstream media, and then you'd have what some people refer to as the conservative media ghetto, right? And I think that was actually an apt description. It's the place where conservative politicians went to be heard by their base and by nobody else. The way I see things trending, and it's very hard to tell whether it'll continue to happen, is such that if it continues to trend that way in 10 years, you'll have this mix of voices that'll be indistinguishable politically, and then you'll have a liberal ghetto. Not that liberals won't have a voice anywhere else, but you'll have a self-reinforced MSNBC talking points memo, HuffPo kind of world, where that'll be closed off to other thought, if it isn't already. And then you'll have the rest of the world, which the internet, news-wise, has democratized in a very positive way. Hard to tell whether that'll continue. It may have a lot to do with whether there are more media acquisitions, whether any of the big guys die on the vine. But I don't think the Daily Caller is part of a conservative ghetto anymore. There is a conservative ghetto, but the walls of it are cracking. And the messaging is getting out to more people, while at the same time, more moderate influences are coming in. So I don't think ghettos are healthy, and I think conservatives are losing theirs and liberals are building one at the same time. That's my opinion. Yes, sir, here.
I started reading the Daily Mail more than 50 years ago, but only really came back to it within the last 10 years, primarily thanks to Drudge listing the British newspapers on his website. And what really drove me to read the Daily Mail was the pictures. I don't know when the photojournalism started the way it is today, but it certainly differentiates you. So when did the photojournalism approach start, and how global is your audience?
The audience is very global. I mean, I don't think more than 40% of our audience is domestic here in the U.S., which again still would make us the biggest newspaper website in the U.S. just with that 40% alone. I mean, look at a world map, and it's a map of our audience. We're literally everywhere. I wouldn't want to put numbers to it, so I won't, but we're literally everywhere. There's nowhere in the world. I mean, the Daily Mail actually now has a print newspaper in India and in Scotland, which it's had for a long time. It's everywhere. In terms of the photography, I don't know the exact year when photography was emphasized more as an element of news telling at the Daily Mail. I will say, however, that it was probably around 10 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, that Martin Clark, the publisher of the Online, created Mail Online. Intensely smart guy and my boss, so he's really smart. Actually, I like Martin quite a good deal. He's a wonderful guy. Very intense, very driven, and knows exactly what he wants. But Mail Online is his brainchild and his baby. And one of his big philosophies is that pictures can often tell a better story than words can. I've seen this in story conferences in his office in London, where literally at the same time we're talking about stories that are breaking around the world, we're looking at the photo feeds. Oh, look, someone took 10 pictures of this burning house in Yemen. What's the story there? Sometimes the photos cause us to look for a story and not the other way around. I think sometimes in news, you have a story and then at the last minute you say, oh, we need a photo of something, don't we? And that's a less powerful story than one that's where you have the photos and we're saying we should write about what these depict. So it's not an accident that maybe a third to a quarter of the stories on the front page of the Daily Mail are photo-driven stories. They all have wonderful photography. I know we pay a bundle for photo contracts with the big agencies and with paparazzi, and we have an office in Hollywood with 7 or 8 people, and that's all they do is chase photo-driven stories. I've personally come to believe that the photography is a very important part of the picture, that the headline, the sort of how we sell the story on the front page to get people to click on it, is critically important, but the photos are equally important. Yes, it's difficult for reporters and editors to insert all those photos and write the captions, but I think without them, we would be the Guardian. I mean, not politically, but it would be no more engaging than that. The idea is not just to get people to know who you are and to get them to want to come to you, but to engage them once they're there. Once you engage them, the Daily Mail's homepage becomes like crack to an addicted monkey, let's be honest. You go on there and oh, that's such a pretty picture. Oh, look at whatever it is. It could be the world's most beautiful sunset, or Putin with a scowl on it, or Kim Kardashian's latest high heels. I don't care what you're looking at. You're looking at it. And then at the same time, there's all these stories in the sidebar that go, ooh, I want to have this too. And, oh, I came here looking for conflict about my favorite soap opera stars, but look, now there's a conflict between Chris Christie and Rand Paul. That might be interesting. And there's a picture of them staring off. The pictures are what causes people to depart from one story and jump to another. And that's self-referral traffic, which is an awful large part of why we stay in business. So pictures are critical. There's no question about it. And I'm very glad to work for the outlet that places such a premium on that. One more question. Morton, you choose. I never want to be the guy who's the bad guy.
Gentleman in the back.
Please don't let it be about Anthony Weiner. I was hoping to avoid him all morning.
China.
China.
How do you penetrate a closed market like China, or reaching people like in North Korea and Iran, but particularly China?
You're talking about China's markets being
They
tariff
close
closed to
off
us?
the internet. They
Yeah.
make it very difficult to penetrate. I just wonder if you're getting
Sure.
any penetration there.
I was in China a few years ago on a trip there, maybe 3 years ago. And I've got friends there who tell me things haven't changed that much since then, but I'll tell you what I saw. I didn't dare, I have my own laptop, but I didn't dare use the hotel internet service or other public Wi-Fi services. I was basically told, don't do that because there'll be a way for them to spider into your laptop and basically look at everything you have while you're online. So what I did is I went to internet cafes and just was very judicious about what I did. Of course, the internet cafes had scores of things that were blocked. When I got there, you couldn't see YouTube. When I got there, there was a big bird flu outbreak, and so they had literally server blocked stories mentioning bird flu or avian influenza or H1N1 anywhere in the metadata. Those stories were blocked. They didn't want people to know how bad it was. But at the same time, in every internet cafe I saw in Beijing and Guiyang, everywhere else, there was a big laminated sheet on the wall, very standardized, like somebody had come up with 1 million of these and distributed it, always the same. And in 6 languages, they had instructions about how to get around the firewall. So the Great Firewall of China has been democratized too. And it was very simple. Here's a proxy you go to, and look, YouTube's there. You can surf whatever you want. And everybody in the internet cafe knew how to do this, no matter what language you spoke. Mandarin, Cantonese, English, Japanese, Korean, whatever it is. So I'm not so worried about the rank and file in China having access to news, to information, to the internet. I do think closed markets for goods and overly punitive tariffs are problematic. But, it's like when friends ask me, well, isn't it horrible that so much of our debt is held by the Chinese? I'll say, okay, yeah, it's not ideal, it's not optimal, as the president once said. But it's not like China could call in its debt tomorrow. If it did, of course, we'd have a lot of fiscal problems. But we'd also then suddenly lack the capital to buy their cheap stuff. Target and Walmart would close without Chinese goods, like tomorrow. The dollar bin at Target, which is my 9-year-old's favorite thing ever, because lots of stuff there is pink and glittery, without made in China, forget it, doesn't exist. We don't make that stuff in Wisconsin. So we do have a fine balance, almost a symbiotic relationship with China's debt, with our debt to China. They really can't call in the debt, and they know that. So as a negotiating tool politically, I suspect that it's very much it's a blunt instrument that can be threatened but not used. Do I want us to not owe money to China? Yeah. Would it be nice if fewer Chinese business magnates were buying skyscrapers here? Yeah. Am I overly worried about it? No. I'm more worried about, personally as an American, about the unfunded liabilities in our budget that have driven the deficit built debts up from an estimate of 16.7 million up into the $80 trillion range. I apologize, trillions, millions. So our real national debt is not $16.7 trillion. It's closer to $80.8 trillion if you include all the future commitments we've made without cash planned to pay for them. That worries me more than the few $1 trillion in notes that the Chinese hold, because I don't think they're going to do much about it. And frankly, they know that if war ever breaks out between us, we'll just cancel those debts and say, screw you. So I'm not worried about that, but overall the fiscal picture is pretty bleak, and I am very concerned. With that, I will say thank you to Morton and thank you to all of you.